Hello, friends. Welcome back to the School of Self Worth. I'm your host, Nicole Song, and today is such a fun topic. It's all about solo travel. And I brought back one of your favorite guests for this conversation, Adele Wang. She and I got to talking during our last podcast episode where she was on talking about the addiction to fixing yourself. So if you haven't listened to that, that one's episode 32. Make sure to check that one out. And she and I started to chat about the topic of traveling solo. So Adele lost her husband recently and she took a solo trip and she had such profound insights and learnings for herself during that trip. And I wanted to bring her on to talk about it because I did the same thing. I had a very epic solo trip a couple of years ago post divorce, and I learned so much about my own self worth, where I was missing it, and how to really reclaim it for myself during that time. So, for those of you who are new to Adele, she mentors professionals struggling with stress and craving a life of purpose, meaning, and connection. And she's the host of the All Things Human podcast and a frequent speaker on consciousness, business psychology, and personal development. So we had such a rich, fun conversation about this particular topic of traveling solo as a woman. So get ready and dig in with us. And we had such an awesome, enlightening conversation. Also, if you're an Asian American woman leader who wants the exact step by step to understand the secret language of intuition, I've got a private podcast that gives you the complete behind the scenes on how to master intuitive communication patterns. DM me secret at Nicole Song on Instagram to get all of the details. Okay, friends, let's do this. Let's dig in. Well, Adele, I'm so happy to have you back on the School of Self Worth. Thank you for being here.
Oh, it's a joy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, this conversation that she and I had last time. So, if you didn't catch up on part one with Adele, we really talked a lot about this constant need to improve yourself all the time. But at the very end of our conversation, so go back and listen to that if you're wondering if like you're a self improvement, self help junkie, like that last episode is definitely for you. And then this one, at the very end, Adele mentioned that she had traveled alone, and I just prompted this thought. I'm like, gosh, that's such a good topic because I feel like that's something where especially if you're married or you have a partner, you start to get used to traveling with other people and having those experiences together. And then when you brought it up, Adele, I actually also had a solo trip a couple of years ago to Hawaii, and it brought up a lot of things for me. And so
Mm.
I just thought, gosh, what an interesting conversation, because I think as women, and again, in partnerships, you tend to travel with other people. So I'm curious if you wouldn't mind sharing with us, like, how this came about and what your experience was like going through this.
Oh, I love this topic. And I think it's useful to ping into why we travel, because I think there are different reasons.
Mm.
I think at least when my husband was around, when I was married, before he passed away, there was always the idea of going away to experience something. So it would be, let's go to Paris, let's go to a city. And, that's I want to experience something objective. Sometimes there would be I want to get away to like a beach, which is, I don't want stimuli. I just want peace and quiet. And so, in terms of traveling, there was always a little bit of a joint discussion. Let's say he wants to go to Greece and I want to go to Rome. So there's a little bit of negotiating there. And if we want to get away, I was more of a mountain person. He's more of a beach person. So there was some negotiation there. And so I think it's useful when you're considering traveling by yourself. First of all, know what is it you would like. Are you looking to immerse yourself in a culture? And it's nice when you finally get to decide, well, where would I like to go? Not so much where we would like to go. It was very disorienting for me, actually, to think, well, what I don't know what I want. It was always this ongoing discussion. Um, and for this past trip, what my motivation was really, I need to get the heck out of Dodge. Um,
Mm.
I had lost my husband very suddenly. I was completely disoriented. And so I wasn't really going away to see the Louvre or anything that stimulating. I did want to go. When I pinged, what do I want? It was different than what Bill would have wanted. I wanted something more soulful, but not quite by myself either. So Bill
Mm.
would be like, okay, if we're going to be quiet, let's go to the beach or the mountains. And this time I noticed I want something that's a little bit more intentional around maybe a small community. Basically, I went for a retreat. And that is something Bill just had no concept of. I don't think men do retreats as much as women. And when I was married, I always sort of wrote those off because unless you have a co-ed retreat, I always felt kind of weird. I'm doing the retreat stuff and Bill's sort of waiting around. But now that he's not here, I said, I really want to do this. And so on the spur of the moment, with not a whole lot of notice, I booked a trip to Malaga, Spain. And although Malaga is an amazing tourist place, I mean, well, beautiful city on the coast of Spain, I really went for a retreat that was in the mountains. It's a beautiful retreat center, a group of women. We're not back and forth into town every day. It was more in the mountains, more secluded. And for me, that is exactly what I needed. So it was a different kind of travel. It reminds me a little bit of that book that came out a while ago, Eat Pray Love, when people just have to get away to find themselves. That was kind of where it was at. So I think there are different kinds of travel, and when you're by yourself, you get to think more about what you would like and how you would like to do it. Bill had a different traveling style than me. So yeah, it brings up a lot about how would you like to move in the world.
Totally. Thank you for sharing all of that, Adele. And I feel like that is, when we're talking about the container of travel. But this is something I actually work on a lot with any of the women that I'm working with is like, what are your preferences? Like, what do you really want in life? And especially people who are partnered, they struggle with this. It's like, you're
Mhm.
always deferring a little sometimes, especially women. We're really trained
Exactly.
into that societally to like always defer. What do
Oh,
you
we
want to
really
eat?
are.
Yeah, right.
And
Like, what do you want? And then all of a sudden your needs aren't really brought into the equation sometimes.
absolutely. And one thing that I've discovered for myself and with my clients is that I think we've been sold something that's not always very useful, this idea of compromise.
Mm.
So, if I want, you know, gray wall color and Bill wants blue wall color, well, let's compromise and get beige where neither of us are happy.
Mm.
And I think that's what we've been trained to do. You want this,
Totally.
I want that. Let's sort of meet in the middle. But it ends up something that neither person was really excited about. And
Right.
so I think in partnership, it's useful to go for the and the more. How can we get something that we both like instead of a watered down kind of compromise? Like what's possible,
Yeah.
And I think that stretches our negotiation skills, or taking a stand for what we want instead of just automatically deferring,
Well,
like, and when you're traveling by yourself, all of a sudden you don't have to defer to anybody. And then it's like, oh,
totally.
well, I don't know. And so there's a lot of self exploration in that.
Well, that's what I was thinking about when you were speaking, because when I went on a trip by myself, so I went to Hawaii for 9 days by myself, which just
Mhm.
like at first felt weird because it's like taking this tropical, beautiful trip that you usually would take with like a partner or a family. And I was going through my divorce was almost complete at that time. And I didn't plan it that way. Like the universe kind of aligned where I planned the trip and the divorce literally was completed, like signed and sealed while I was gone. And so I treated it as a divorce trip. But it was really interesting because I learned so much about myself going by myself. And because wasn't a trip like a retreat or with my girlfriends, like it was literally me surrounded mostly by couples, on this beautiful place and like just exploring on my own. And I had to really check in a lot because I had nobody else to ask. I was like, well, what do you want to do, Nicole? Like, you got to decide, like, what do you want for dinner? Do you want to go on this adventure? Do you want to do this? And
Yeah.
I'm curious how that experience was for you when you had to make literally all the
Oh,
decisions.
I love this because what I should mention is that the first portion of my trip to Spain was an intentional retreat. So you
Mhm.
show up, pretty much everything is already decided in terms of the food, which was wonderful. There was an itinerary because I just wanted to be taken care of. I was such a
Yeah.
wreck. But
Yeah.
then after the retreat, I actually stayed in Spain on my own, kind of like what you might have done in Hawaii, to travel by myself for 3 days, 4 days. And
Mhm.
that is a different experience because from moment to moment, I had no idea what I was doing, in terms, I mean, I had a few ideas. I want to see this and that. But for me, I learned so much about myself just sitting my butt down in a cafe on a sidewalk in Malaga and sitting there watching people and just feeling the sights of the city, noticing things, and also not the constant chatter. Like when you're talking with someone, you can be so involved with the conversation, you don't notice as much. And I've noticed this, like there's a difference when you hiking by
Mhm.
yourself versus hiking with a partner or a group. It's not better or worse. It's just different.
Totally.
And at first, I was a little disoriented. Like I'm sitting there, kind of, you know, and then I lost myself in the experience. And I think I was a little self conscious at first. I'm by myself, and a table for one, and I was caught up with that. And then I think it took like a couple days, and that went away, and it
Mhm.
was very freeing. Because no one else noticed. I'm just like bombing around, and yeah. So I learned quite a bit about myself in terms of just I feel like this, and I'm going. We don't need to plan. We don't
Mhm.
need to negotiate. Uh, Bill was not as much into museums as I was, so he would tire after a little bit. So there was a sense of, well, okay, so I don't get to see everything I want. He sees a little more than what he wants. And, there was a little bit of that instead of, well, I'm going to go for as long as I want or as short as I want. It's very freeing.
Well, and you realize when you're traveling alone and doing things like that, and retreat or not, like whether you're on your own, that you have, sometimes I found myself constantly putting time limits on or trying to like create a plan or create a structure, even though there was no structure in the day because I was
Yes.
so not used to structure. And then I really had to like let myself be like, hey, you can just do whatever you feel like. Like you don't have to follow and adhere to any
Yes,
artificial idea of like how to structure the day.
absolutely. And I don't know about you, but in my situation with Bill, neither of us were very strong planners. So there was always kind of hoping the other person would set the tone
Yeah,
or the lead, because it's easier to take someone else's suggestions and say, "Oh, I don't like this," than just, "Well, what do you want?" And we this
totally.
was a theme in our relationship that we were so hoping that someone else would just do the heavy lifting, and so it was a
Mhm.
growth edge for our relationship, of how to negotiate so that people aren't just waiting to be led. And I think in Bill's situation, he worked so hard and in a leadership position high up in Microsoft. The last thing he wanted to do on vacation is to do more leadership.
Mhm.
And he was married to someone like me who hates planning. I can't stand the logistics. And so we found a travel agent, good old fashioned travel agent, to give us an itinerary. And then we would pick it apart and, add this, take away that. And that was how we found our way, instead of just like, bickering too much about it. We found someone that's their job, is to plan something lovely. And that was something we learned. If there's something that neither of us likes to do, if you can outsource it, so much the better. And then when I was traveling by myself, I also had a travel agent suggest a few things, but I told her, look, I need at least 2 afternoons of nothing. Just
Mm.
wandering around the streets of Malaga. I'll be fine. And he's like, oh, okay. And I discovered this, I discovered that. So yeah. How do you like to travel? And I
Mhm.
tend to be very intuitive in the moment. I don't want too much planned. I just want to go with the flow. Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like what you're sharing too, and I love how you're talking about both. I feel like what I consider both like the practical components of it and then that intuitive self-worth place of it, which are different, right? You have to kind of dance between the two. It's like the physical, like you had a travel agent who supported you, you had the
Yes.
retreat and then some structure. And then there's that intuitive worthiness of like, how can because that was actually what I was struggling with on my trip is like feeling worthy of this. It felt very indulgent. Like I'd stayed at a really nice resort for a couple of days. I took
Yeah.
myself out to dinner and I was just
Hmm.
like, wow, like am I worthy of just being able to splurge on myself? Because I had actually never really splurged
Yes.
completely on a travel trip like that. And I'm curious if that came up for you.
It did. It
Mm,
did. And, I don't know, somewhere in my brain programming, there's my brain is just programmed to be frugal all the time. I don't know why.
mm,
I don't need to be. But, sitting down in a restaurant, my eyeball would naturally gravitate towards things that were less expensive. And then I thought, well, why not? So yeah, I did feel a little weird ordering something, just for me, and something that I wanted to try, a little exotic there, or I never heard of this dish. And just going for it. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. There's something about travel that will force you out of your comfort zone, or it's going to show you exactly where your comfort zone is. And especially if you're partnered, because we're both a little disoriented, a little bit prickly sometimes. How does the metro work? Or we got to get here on time. Who's reading the map? It's not always as easy as people think, unless you're on a cruise ship or something where you're just taken care of. But I like I like to be on my feet and figuring things out. And so when you're traveling with someone, there's a little bit more static in the air. He's trying to figure it out. I'm trying to figure it out. And when I'm by myself, um, yeah, I didn't have anyone to bicker with. I had to sort of figure it out by myself, and I was quite proud of myself.
Yeah, how did that feel then for you? Were you challenged by that, or did you enjoy it more than you thought you did, or did
I,
stuff come up for you because you're like, "Oh, am I not supposed to
I,
enjoy this?"
I've actually alternated. There were moments where I felt a little bit vulnerable. I'll
Mm,
be honest. I had a mishap on the last 2 days where my wallet disappeared. It disappeared with my credit cards, cash. Here I am in a foreign country with no ID.
mm,
Not a good feeling. And I
mhm.
remember feeling, gosh, I'm by myself. Some of the people there didn't speak English. So I was just like, oh my God, so, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, where's Bill? If someone were there, blah, blah, blah. And then I realized, well, you call the police. The police speak English. There's someone around who speaks English. You learn to get more resourceful instead of where's someone to, back me up. But I
Totally.
was a little bit more careful. There were times that I didn't divulge too much. I was just using a little bit of common sense.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, and I was considering of going to Morocco because I was like, wow, I've come this far around the world. And some people said, by yourself, maybe it's better to join a group. I didn't know anything about Morocco. I'm like, heard of
Mhm,
it, let's go. And people said, well, for that you might want a little bit more guidance.
mhm.
So I could feel where my edge of comfort was. Like some women, no problem. They can go to Tunisia all by themselves. I haven't mastered that level of adventurous risk yet.
Mhm.
So maybe the next trip. But I was around some women who are very savvy. They have traveled the world and they know how to travel. They've been
Yeah.
single a long time. Sometimes they're joining single women's travel groups. Sometimes they're backpacking. I'm like, oh my God, that would be new for me to backpack around Europe. Was that something you ever considered?
Well, I mean, I actually did that, like, in college, but, like, I mean, I say backpacking, I mean, we were really in hostels and using backpacks versus, like, to me, real backpacking is, like, in the mountains, like,
Okay.
backpacking, right?
Yeah.
But, yeah, I totally did the backpack around Europe when I was in college, but I was doing it with girlfriends, so I was
Yeah.
with a couple other people, and I think also at that age when you're 20, 21, like, you
Yeah.
don't have that, like, you have the fear and you have the wariness, but it's not quite the same as, like, when you're
Exactly.
older. And
Exactly.
then once you are older and you've been with partners or people and you haven't traveled as much. I mean, I think that's the big thing. And one of the things I got out of taking a trip by myself is that I'm like, "Oh, like I probably should do this on occasion." You know what I mean? And like sometimes I
Good
travel for
for you.
myself for
Yeah.
work away from my husband, but
Uh-huh.
just a trip to like indulge for yourself, like completely
Yeah.
alone is I think really undervalued.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because you start to get out of your brain and feel more sensual of the
Mhm.
experience. And for me, traveling now at this age by myself, I think is different than how I might have traveled when I was in my 20s. Because at this point in my life, I wasn't as interested in the least expensive option of everything.
Right.
I mean, I could have stayed at a hospital, and I thought, no, I don't think so. So I learned about myself. I have a certain standard now for comfort, for
Mhm.
safety that I think in my 20s I would have said, so we're at different points in life. I don't know if it means I'm less adventurous. Maybe it's just I have a standard of what my body needs.
Mhm.
Food was more important. I think in my 20s I would have just eaten anything, just, which
Mhm.
I did. Street food is fine, but I also said, no, I want the experience. I'm going to
Yeah.
go to a nice restaurant and really experience this for myself. I wouldn't have thought of that in my 20s. And so I think there's a little maturing process that when you travel in your 20s, your focus is different than a little later.
And I
Yeah.
actually, and I, no, I totally felt the same way because I was like, okay, I'm going to go to the nice restaurant. I'm going to order the drinks and the food, and I'm going to really enjoy myself. And then I cooked some of the time when I was there. But I also like rented a car and went on adventures on my own. But I chose adventures where I felt like other people were around and I wouldn't
Yeah.
be totally isolated, right? But
Yeah.
it's an interesting thing because one of the things I really got out of it is for so many of us who have partners or previously were partnered that it is actually important to occasionally test this because you and I talked about this a little bit in our last conversation about how important it is for us to really tune into ourselves and know who we are. And I actually think that traveling by yourself is one of the biggest ones, especially if you have been partnered for a long time
I
and you've
agree.
never done it. Like, wow, well, you learn so much about
You
yourself,
learn.
even if you took like 3 days
Yeah.
alone to take a trip and not with girlfriends and not,
Exactly.
just literally by
Just,
yourself.
I think
Yeah.
that's key. I think
Hmm.
there's something about solo travel that you can't. There's no substitute for it.
Hmm.
That and I think it has to be for, I would like to say, at least an extended period. Anyone can go solo for a day. But if you were to go solo, I think it takes a good 3 or 4 days for your brain to just switch into a different mode. At least I know for me, once I landed in Spain, I was still like, I don't know, I was not the real me for a while. Probably, I was
Mm,
just so keyed up. And it took a good 4 or 5, maybe a week before I noticed I was just thinking differently
yeah.
because there's nothing like being physically put into an unfamiliar surroundings to turn on the rest of you that's sort of atrophied. When you're in your house, you're living your regular schedule. So there are parts of you that go to sleep, I think.
Mm,
They literally go to sleep and you don't notice how much is on autopilot. And autopilot makes day to day living easy. We're not constantly thinking about our next meal or how to get out of the driveway or how to get to the grocery store. But when everything is unfamiliar, these parts of us, I think, come online. And there's a little bit of fits and starts, like, whatever, but that's good. You start to feel more like, this is where I've been. Like I'm alive again. Maybe talking to people you wouldn't normally talk to.
yeah.
Um, I think that's always interesting how people change on travel. I don't know about you, but I discovered I was having conversations with people that I wouldn't have thought of.
Mhm. Well, I feel like I actually talked a lot more to people who worked where I was at, and that was interesting because, people who were on vacation, I didn't end up talking to, but I went to Hawaii right also after they had opened up after the pandemic, and I really learned a lot about the place in a way because I wouldn't have talked to them otherwise. Because if I was with somebody else, I would have been talking to them the whole time, and
Exactly.
sure, we would have chit-chatted a little bit with people who work there, but, like, I really had, like, longer conversations because I was by myself, so they would just
Yeah.
talk to me. And then I really
Yes.
learned so much about like lockdown on Kauai and how challenging it was for them. And just I felt like I really got a much deeper insight into the place I was visiting
I agree.
because I was alone. Yeah.
There's something about time because if there's someone there, there's
Hmm.
not that they're waiting on you, but when you have nothing but time and it's just you and your attention's not distracted of what,
Hmm.
not to say that someone with you wouldn't be a great part of the conversation, but there seems to be something so lovely about not having anyone or anywhere to go, just you with whoever you're talking to.
Yeah.
And I think people can feel that because
Yeah.
there's
They
something
can.
about traveling in a group. There's this group energy. People traveling in groups, which is lovely. It's a different experience. But I don't know if it just feels different. What do you think?
No, I'm with you because I feel like everything about going on a trip by myself was challenging for me. Because like even when I was leading up to, I was like trying to get friends to go with me, and no one would go for whatever reasons. And then I had to tell people I was going by myself, and even that was like a challenge. Like they're like, "You're just gonna go to 9 days in Hawaii by yourself," and I'm like, "Yeah." And they're like, "Great." I mean, people were encouraging and supportive, but I had to feel ownership of that choice, right? And
Yes.
then once I was there, yeah, and like being present, but being present without being anxious is such
Yeah.
a balance because I kind of had this like, and it's I think for women really trained into us that we're constantly in danger if we're by ourselves or in unfamiliar
Yes.
places, right? And so I had to really work that with myself. I had to work on how do I feel about eating something really lovely for myself, indulging for myself, or going for a hike by myself, and then just literally making so many decisions the whole time I was alone.
Yes.
and every piece of it. I mean, I feel like I was really stretched when I went by myself.
Yes.
Like pretty much the entire trip, I felt stretched.
Yeah, you
And then at
come
the
back,
yeah,
yeah,
and
just
then I
more
felt so
alive.
proud of myself because it was like so big for me. Yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't realize how much I had internalized the idea of the man protecting the woman. Like,
Right.
because we don't realize this. It's subconscious. But for me to go off on by myself, even I was a little bit embarrassed about it at first. Like,
Mm,
you don't have anyone to go with you, or like there was this weirdness.
right.
And I realized I'd subconsciously expected Bill to sort of be my protector everywhere we go. I'm like, why? Where'd that come from? And
And I have that too, and then, we're talking obviously very heteronormative relationships, but it's still funny because, I sometimes I'm like, "Well, could they actually protect me? Like, are we actually safe? Or is it just this
it's just,
mentality
yeah,
that you're safer because there's someone else there?" And it is really interesting because I felt the same way. Like, sometimes for me, just like, oh, it's like, "Oh, I can relax because someone else is with me."
yeah.
But then what do you sacrifice sometimes with that? Like in terms of like
Mhm.
you really paying attention and being present and tuning into yourself instead of just like sort of
Yes.
releasing to the other person, you
And
know?
I think maybe we've over exaggerated certain risks. There's no
Mm,
reason why. I just went to Malaga, Spain. We're not talking about some place where you really do need to know what you're doing. And I have a lot of respect for the seasoned traveler woman, the
mm,
solo traveler woman that knows how to keep herself safe. She's taken on that responsibility for herself. She's very savvy. Do this, not that. It's just common sense. For people who travel a lot, I'm like, good on you. But
mhm.
I'm like, how much have we exaggerated this idea that, oh, you by yourself, are you going to be okay? Not that anyone ever said that, but there was a little bit of that echo in me. Whether I
Mhm.
learned it somewhere from our culture, oh, you got to be careful. I don't think that's helpful. Um, I don't know. It's something I'm unpacking because I don't think men think this way. And men want to go, they just
Yeah.
go. They don't sit there and think about, oh, I'm a single guy. But women have been conditioned to be a little more cautious. Now, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, somewhere. Obviously, it's useful to take care when necessary. But if we have made women scared and nervous, like, oh, I don't think that encourages women. Go do something and find these parts of you that have fossilized and,
Mhm.
and go to your edge. And I mean, that's when you come alive. And once you've done it once, wouldn't you agree with me, Nicole? Now you want to do it again, right? Like the first time
Yeah.
is always like, can I do this all by myself? And then it's like, heck yeah.
Yeah, totally. Well, and it's interesting for me because I've been married for less than a year. And so now I'm looking at this experience where it's like taking myself away from people feels harder. So it's not
Mm,
so much about like going away, it's more about like removing myself from the people I love and being around them. And then it's an interesting balance because back then when I was single and it was also, pandemic times, I'm like, oh, whatever. All I have is time on my hands. And
right.
then it was such a good stretch. And now I feel like the stretch for me is like taking that space. And I feel like for a lot of the women listening, probably that's a case for them too. It's like the stretch of, can you just go by yourself? And this is not for anybody else. And that is like the ultimate level because I feel like women struggle to take 10 minutes for themselves every day, let alone actually investing fully in a trip for themselves. And it's not a self improvement trip in the traditional way. It's not a retreat. It's not like something else, but like literally the stretch is I need some time by myself to explore,
Exactly.
be with me. And like I feel like that would continue to be a stretch for me. Like the idea of that, I'm like, okay, how would I make that work in a year? Like to do that for
Exactly.
myself again.
I did notice a distinct difference between when I was going for a retreat, when there are
Mhm.
people expecting me and there's a whole thing agenda, versus when I was on my own. And I'm glad I did that
Mhm.
because it allowed me to feel the difference in my expectation of myself. One
Yeah.
is, there's a program and I'm in this beautiful place with women, but the other is you're on your own, and that's refreshing. And yeah, I, I, I imagine once if I were to do this again with Bill around, I think he would have been very puzzled. Why do you want to go by yourself? Like,
Mm.
do you not want to travel with me? Like, there would have been a little bit more of that stickiness. And then I'd feel like, okay, let's go together. And I would not have had another solo experience. because Bill he wasn't really a solo traveler himself. So he was like, "Why would you want to go by yourself?" Like, I'm like, because it's awesome. I think if I had pushed it, he would have been fine with it. But oh my God, the guy would have been nervous about me every single day. I want you to check in. I want you to text me how you're doing
Yeah.
every night. I need to hear it because he was like a worry wart.
Yeah.
And so I think we've sort of programmed people to be unnecessarily afraid. And yet, if I were going to parts of the world that aren't as secure, I would want somebody just, if I disappear, call somebody,
I mean, I had well, this is funny because I had a person in Seattle who was like my friend's Karen was like my contact while I was gone, and so every time I would keep her a date, she's like, "Can you please just tell me what you're doing every day so like somebody knows what's happening?" And so yeah, so I was like, "Yeah." So I would just like text her my itinerary and like let her know if I was back, and but then I was like, I was out on a hike one day and I was like, she is really far away from me. Like she's in Seattle, I'm in Kauai, I'm on a hike. If something happens to me, like it could be a long time
yeah,
before anybody knows what's going on. And so that was an interesting experience to be like, wow, really feel like alone on this
yeah.
totally different level. And at the same time, I also was totally fine. Right. And it's an interesting balance. And I feel like, we are like, we're trained to be like, oh my gosh, you can't be alone. Like, if
E-
someone has to know where you are at any given time.
Exactly.
And right. And then I was like, but I know that I'm also totally safe. Like, this is a really popular hike. There's like lots of
Well,
people around.
and it's interesting you said that because I actually felt less secure when I was hiking here in the U.S. than
Mm,
when I went to Spain by myself. There is a place in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's phenomenally beautiful. And this was after Bill passed away, and I was looking for a way to kind of grieve. And I realized things happen in American forests and parks. We see it every day in the news. There's some woman who got abducted on this trail. And there was a very real risk. When you're out there in American national forest by yourself, you do have to kind of think about these things. This never crossed my mind in Malaga, Spain. I felt more physically insecure here in the US because I knew if someone jumped me on a trail, it's all over. There's nobody around for,
mhm,
and I'm like, oh God, and I'm not going to be packing anything. But I thought, wow, what a shame
mhm.
that you can't even go into the mountains. I don't care about bears, coyotes. I'm worried about
Mhm.
two-legged people that
Yeah.
go around and attack solo women. And I think that's a real shame.
Yeah, and it does. It makes you like look at all of these things and like
Yeah.
there's just so much, you and I think both teach and work on this a lot, like so much conditioning. And
Yeah.
I feel like what's happening here is we're just getting really to talk about it because that's
Yeah.
what happens. You go on a solo trip, you start to do things outside of your norm and you really come up against that conditioning. And sometimes that conditioning can be it was really strong for me on that trip. And I really had to work
Mm-hmm.
myself through it every single day. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
actually really glad because I feel like it made me see it in a totally different light
Yeah.
like when I was younger, like I lived in China for a year by myself and like I was really aware of all that stuff when I was younger and then you like get into this comfortable life and everything is really good and you know everything and then that travel does start to teach you how to stretch yourself again. And I loved what you talked about awakening parts of yourself because like
Mm-hmm.
there are very real parts of ourselves that go dormant in certain times of our lives and so like how can you actually start to bring it back to
Exactly. They
life
go
again?
underground.
Yeah.
And I noticed that I got to really get to know things instead of just believing things.
Mhm.
There's nothing like real life experience. Like you might have had an expectation about something, or the way the Spanish folks are this way, or the Greek people are that way, and then you actually meet them and you talk to them, and it's like, oh my gosh, to have a real life experience is nothing like what I read. I mean, maybe a few courtesies of how to say thank you and things like that, but people are people, and I think the more people can just run into each other and have a conversation, the
Mhm.
better. Because people are getting awfully siloed these days, you
Yeah, and
know?
it's true, and it does, and it really stretches you to meet different types of people and to yeah, like, I'm also totally in the world, like, I know my people, I'm in my communities where I live,
Yes.
and then, yeah, when you go somewhere else, and especially a foreign country, and I wasn't in a foreign country, but when you go to a new place and you really have to, yeah, cross language barriers and cultural barriers, there's so much richness there.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful experience. So if you're listening and you're kind of thinking about this, be adventurous, and
Mhm.
what parts of you will come online when you're in a place you've never been before on your own, thinking on your feet and
Mhm.
asking, what do I want to eat today? I mean, even that, like even food from meal to meal is different than where you just go downstairs to your fridge or, I'll just get something on the way home from work. You don't even think about it. But when you're traveling, every meal is an adventure,
Absolutely.
and how do you want to do? Do you want to sit down? Do you want to buy something to go? Where do you do that? How much does it cost? I mean, all these things that you normally don't have to think about. I was in Spain and I had never had that type of it's a type of ham, Iberian ham. It's
Mm,
like the pride of Spain, right? And I had no idea. So I'm looking at it, and it's funny because what's so ordinary to them is exotic to me, and vice versa.
totally.
So everybody, if you're listening, do it. It's good for you.
Yeah,
Good.
and I would say, like, this one's gonna come out at the beginning of the year, and it's a great time to really look and reset of, like, what are my priorities? How do I actually take care of myself? And if you've never done that before, I actually feel like it's super important to be like, "Okay, when I'm looking at the bigger picture of the year, instead of just slotting the things in that I always slot in, like, what is it that I really want? What's really gonna help me expand and know about myself?" Like, to me, I'm always like, "Okay, how am I gonna know myself in a deeper way this year?" And this
Yeah.
is something I feel like would be a really important
It's
way to get to know yourself in
it's
a
it's
different way.
excellent because you're around people who don't know you. I mean, even if you
Totally.
travel with somebody, they already kind of know you. But if you can be anyone, you can sort of if you wanted to, you can make up some wild story about what you do in the states. No one would know. But it's very refreshing to be around people where no one has any idea. You can recreate yourself. If you're normally shy, you might find yourself talking up a storm. If you feel like trying some bizarre funky outfit that you normally wouldn't because you're more of a classic kind of dresser, you get to
Mhm.
explore all kinds of yourself. Not a club person, but you're going to go to some club in Paris just to see what it's like, and no one here has to know. That's the
That's so
thing.
true. Mhm. Well, I have one more question for you, Adele. Did you find, because you were healing obviously from the passing of your husband, like, what did you find for yourself by taking that trip?
Oh my goodness. For me, it was very much an energetic, how do I say? I had to see different kinds of sunlight. I needed to eat different food. I needed to see the ocean. I needed to hear different kinds of language around me. Like I needed to be fed in a way that was not so um, cognitive. Just it's kind of like being pulled out of one environment and plopped somewhere else and just sort of being incubated with totally new experiences, new everything.
Mhm.
That's what I needed. I didn't want to talk too much. And in the
Mm,
losing of myself, in the sensory, the sensual, the way the light hits the ground is different in Malaga than it does in Atlanta. And just noticing the way people move, their bodies are different. The diet is different. I felt, I don't know, it was very nourishing to me in a spiritual way, more than if I had just been talking about my sadness. So I just sat in a
mm,
cafe sometimes and I might be crying, but I'm just sort of
mhm,
taking in the world. It's like being in an incubator. At least that was for me. That's what I
mhm.
needed. Yeah,
Yeah.
and the ocean is lovely. There's nothing like soaking in the Mediterranean and feeling the salt water soothe you.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, so powerful. Well, thank you for
yeah,
sharing that. Yeah,
yeah.
thank you for sharing that. Well, Adele, it's been such a joy to have you on the conversation again. I just love talking to you. I feel like there's just so many interesting
There's
insights
so
that you
many things we
bring.
could keep talking on. I love what you're doing with your podcast. Thank you for having me back again. And
Yeah.
you asked such wonderful questions.
Oh, thank you. And well, what's the best way for people to find out more about you?
Sure. I'm pretty easy to find. You just Google my name or my website, Adele Wang, with an A, Wang. Um, I'm on a lot of the social media platforms. I do have a podcast. I would love to have you as a guest, Nicole. All Things Human, where we're talking about the human spirit, what it takes to live this one bodacious life. We have one life. What are we
Mhm.
spending our time doing? And
Mm,
I'm basically talking to people who have lived in a life of always getting ready. I'm working on myself that someday then my life will finally start. And like, we're deep diving now. What do you need now?
mhm, mhm.
And that's why I love this topic. You might need to just travel and find out all these pockets of you that have fossilized, never been developed, or you didn't even know, and come home changed in some way. Because
Mhm.
I'm more interested in being a traveler than a tourist. A tourist is, you go to see stuff, but it's a little bit more of a consuming mindset. Like, I'm going to go see this. A traveler takes in everything, and it informs you. It informs your heart. It informs who you are, and you come back in some way changed. That to me is really the essence of our conversation. It's not about just going to see something for the sake of seeing something. I want to go see the David, the Da Vinci, the Sistine Chapel. Those are all lovely. But it's really more the experience that you come back changed in a way.
Yeah.
You cannot get this out of books. And so
Yeah.
I do talk about this on my podcast, All Things Human. What's happening to us? It's an energetic immersion, and then we get out of all these weird things we've been taught, patriarchal or whatever it is. We didn't even know,
Mhm.
until it's like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm on Instagram, YouTube, all the major channels. If people want to, inquire, I've got a free gift, on manifestation, stress. People are welcome to download that, or just reach out if you want to have a conversation.
Amazing. Well, Adele, thank you so much for sharing your gifts and your wisdom with the School of Self Worth. And I'm so happy to have you back on with us today.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.